Hello and welcome to Trailblazers. My guest today is Simon Gilchrist, founder of Mayfair Health. Simon is a physiotherapist with over 20 years experience in helping patients all the way from the everyday athlete through to the elite performer at the very top of their sport. Simon's practice and his approach is holistic and full body, so it means that this is anything but one-dimensional. Today, Simon and I discuss the foundational principles of movement, how he would approach strategies for long-term health outcomes, and why movement as a child is so important for setting yourself up for success later in life. We will also touch on the mental and emotional component of movement, with movement being a key driver in regulating emotional well-being and helping to mitigate stress. I guess let's start from the very beginning.
Yep.
What are your foundational pillars for general health, well-being, and looking after yourself, hopefully, to well in your 80s?
Personally, or what I try to impart on some of my clients? And
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, I think, is there a difference between the two?
Okay, good question. Probably not, but I think every time we're laying it down to clients, we're trying to bespoke it to them. So for me, I think the biggest lever that you can pull, if you sleep okay, if you eat okay, and you manage your stress okay-ish, the biggest lever that you can pull from a wellness point of view is exercise.
Okay.
Okay, and trying to optimize that is key. You know, okay, we talk about recovery, and that's absolutely vital. But if you can get and I missed that out of that little pillar. But if you sleep, eat, and manage your stress okay, I do think that exercise is the biggest lever and the best tool that anyone can have to make substantial change to their well-being.
Okay.
So if I had to look at sort of the foundational sort of pillars, I think optimizing a strength component within your exercise, optimizing a cardiovascular component, and there's a couple of components to that, and then optimizing some mobility and core work as part of that. And that's your basic sort of exercise foundation. And you need some daily load. You need daily function. You need to get some of those steps in. You know, we need to move. And so that's a very simplistic overview of exercise. But I think the other real key foundation is sleeping well.
Yeah. If you were going to break it down for one of your clients who comes in to see you and they really are not sleeping well, they're kind of like high stress job, grabbing food on the go and all of this sort of stuff. Like when you're looking at your physio practice and you're trying to get this person, presumably they've come to you, they've got an ailment, they've got something that they're recovering from, whether that be post-surgery, in my case, obviously with my shoulder, whether that's something that's presenting as a bit of an issue before surgery. How do you try and tackle that when they're not familiar with this? And I think from the point of view of someone who's maybe not had exposure to a lot of training in their life previously, and a lot of these concepts, how do you try to introduce them, get that start to that conversation?
Yeah, I think we probably try and identify the biggest contributing issues or contributing factors that will make the greatest change to them. Whether that be actually just dialing up their recovery processes initially might be the most sensible approach to raise their awareness about how they're not recovering. And it's interesting, we have a wellness, a digital health product, and part of this, we get someone to wear to use a wearable for sort of 3 to 5 days, and it's a 2-lead ECG, so it's very, very reliable and accurate. And the discrepancy of what they're self-reporting across all these pillars. So, and we're talking about the lifestyle pillars. So we're talking about exercise, sleep, nutrition, stress, bad habits, and social relationships or social connection. And they will score themselves on these parameters that we've designed. And then we'll get them to wear this wearable. And then we'll marry it up with some objective movement screens and strength markers and that sort of thing. So we're tailoring, we're sort of covering all our bases. And so often these high-flying execs or individuals who feel like they cope very well with stress and they're not under stress, their body is showing quite visible signs.
What are some of the typical telltale markers?
They're not getting a restful sleep. You know, they might be in bed for an adequate time, but actually they're waking through the nights. They're, having a restless sleep, and they're getting up and not feeling rested. Some of the other markers, they're just, as you said, sort of grabbing food on the go or eating late or not allowing themselves that sort of downtime to sort of decompress between work and, getting into bed. And I think also the device that we use, it allows us to track sort of active and passive stress. So it allows us to understand actually what their levels of stress are like through the day, where they might not recognize that they are under quite a substantial load and their system is showing it though.
It reminds me a lot of that analogy of the two fish swimming along in water, and then the older fish swims past them and says, "Hey lads, how's the water today?" And the two of them look at each other and are like, "What's he talking about, water?" When you're in that mindset and you're operating at this high level of stress and you don't really know, how do you try to intervene in that situation to say, look, these are some of the habits based on the data that we're trying to address. How does your kind of platform, how does the digital solution that you've got start to lead them on that pathway and that journey?
I think we try and identify, and this might be any client that comes into us or patient that comes into us, try and identify the biggest issues that are stopping them from moving forwards, whether that be pain at the moment, whether that be, post-op, whether that be, their recovery process are poor, or whether that be someone who's an over-exerciser or someone who has just not done anything for a long time. So we've got to build some very, very basic foundations and establish how their system will tolerate any sort of load. And so, at the foundation of pretty much everything we do is movement. Yet some of the time it will be relatively easy to recognize the state that someone walks through the door and to be able to identify that actually we need to start with some calming strategies. We need to start with some recovery strategies. We need to look at just dialing down, calming down that sympathetic nervous system and try and see if we can wean them out of that fight or flight system, because actually they're not even going to start responding to anything that we're going to throw at them if they're consistently and always in that state. So I think it's just about trying to identify where that client is at that point in time, and a lot of the time just our subjective assessments will help to elucidate that. But then we also have this digital health and digital wellness product that also dives much deeper into that, so that we can get some very reliable metrics that we can remeasure and go back and actually objectively validate and show them, look, this is actually where you're at the moment. And guys in particular, but a lot of people like the data, so they can actually understand that, well, there is a discrepancy between what they're perceiving and where their body is at and what actually output their body is delivering on, or how it's impacting their body.
When you see someone come into the physio clinic, do you often find that there are particular aspects that they're, self-reporting as being kind of discrepant with, obviously highlighted stress and stuff like that? Do people tend to overestimate how much exercise they're doing as intensely as they're doing it versus not? Are there other kind of like gauges that are very common that people misreport on? Yeah,
definitely. I think there's probably a few cohorts of people here that we talk about. I think we have one distinct group who are probably high achieving, who completely underestimate or underplay stress. they're type A sort of personalities, and they just high achieving and will just go and make it happen.
When nothing else works.
Yeah. And they're relatively easy to identify because they will come in and they'll be, on their phone, and they'll be, pretty high, intense sort of energy, and it'll take a while to sort of dive in under that. And that's, a little yellow flag to start going, okay, right, there's a few things going on here. How do we manage that and deal with that? I think there's also a group that, I was going to use the word oversharers, but perhaps not. That's not quite fair. But people who are just more outwardly anxious and are happy sort of reporting that. They're often the easier ones to actually set on a pathway because you've immediately got an open discussion point to be able to go, okay, right, well, let's dive into that. What's driving the anxiety? What's driving the issues? What's driving the stress levels with your body, with your work, with whatever we're seeing them with? And so that's another cohort. And then when we get to, sleep is a whole nother sort of kettle of fish, and most people over-report how much they're sleeping, and how effective they're sleeping.
Yeah, time in bed versus actual time sleeping is a very different thing.
Yeah, exactly. And so, most people need to take an hour off their time in bed at least to then go, okay, maybe that's close to your sleep time if you've been able to relatively get to sleep fairly soon after getting into bed. And so that's a pattern that we see quite commonly. And then the exercises. I think there's very few people who, if they haven't worked in an athletic world or an athletic population, who really understand the level of intensity that you actually need to work at to really make very substantial change to the body. Mm-hmm. And that's very common and very clear that where a lot of practitioners fall down is that actually they may have the right recipe, but they just haven't turned it up enough. So
I can imagine you with those particular clients as well, you're going to have those people that sometimes you probably almost have to stop them doing too much. Completely. Because, well, more is more.
More is better. And I think we know that you need to train smarter rather than harder a lot of the time. And it's getting that right sort of balance and load equation right. But there are definitely a cohort where we have to really push and we have to demonstrate to them. We have to take them through their sessions and get them to a point where they're, particularly fatigued. Even, if it's trying to, reactivate a VMO after a knee injury, those quads need to fatigue to actually get substantial change. And people don't know how to push that, but the skill set is often then being able to push that appropriately without causing a flare in pain. But then there's another cohort, as you've alluded to, which are a bunch of people who are probably your type A personalities or perhaps, more sort of obsessive an obsessive sort of inclination or tendencies. And they're the ones that will just go, okay, we'll set 3 sets of 12 it must be better if I do 5. It must be better if I do this twice a day. I'm just getting more in. I've got time, so why don't I do it? And that they come back in and go, my shoulder's really flared. I'm just not sure why.
That bursitis I came in with a little while ago seems to not be getting better. It's getting worse.
Yeah. Well, let's map out what you've been doing. Okay, so how often are you doing your exercises? And so that's a question that we ask. And there's a smaller minority who fall into that category.
Yes, I can imagine so. It sounds like the practice that you've kind of evolved is much more holistic in the way that you approach it. It's very much not your kind of, you come in with this, I'm going to give you a prescriptive series of exercises. You're asking people about their sleep, their nutrition, their stress levels, all of this sort of stuff. Where did that interest in that approach come from, and how did your training kind of evolve over time for you to kind of get to this point where actually you have a much greater perception and awareness of the holistic factors that contribute to someone's recovery and therefore obviously longevity?
Yep. Good question. My background is a physio, and then I went and did a Master of Sports Physio, and I worked across elite sport and travelled with some Olympic teams and did training camps and altitude camps with different Olympic teams. And it always sort of struck me that, okay, what they had available to them and what someone else, Joe Bloggs, had available to him in the clinic was quite a discrepancy. But I just never saw why that should be the case, because what we should be offering and delivering to that individual should be exactly the same, yet we're just taking them to a slightly different level. And so looking at stepping back from, the elite sports world, and we still do a bit of that, but that's less of our bread and butter. It was really about, well, actually, a lot of the problems that we're seeing in Joe Bloggs and individuals are related to how they're living their life and how they are not being able to maximize and optimize themselves across multiple parameters. And these were a lot of the things that actually were holding them back from progressing through an injury or recovering post-op, or, being able to sort out that niggly back that they've seen multiple people for. And so quite quickly, working with athletes, actually they're in an optimal environment. Okay, yes, they train incredibly hard, but they've got most of the tools at their fingertips. Yes, okay, maybe they don't get paid enough in some sectors or overpaid in other, some of the professional sports. But they could have on tap a psychologist if they were wanting to, a nutritionist, S&C coach, physio, massage, sports doc, this whole sort of holistic team. And so working in London over a number of years, you quite quickly recognise that actually so many of the issues that people are coming up against are not just simple mechanical issues. They're far more complicated than that, and they involve, more complexities in their life. And actually working and diving into those, you can actually make sometimes a more profound difference to those individuals than perhaps, rehabbing a grade 2 hamstring strain to get them back on the track. It's a lot of fun, but there's a relatively linear pathway to get that athlete back. Whereas if you've got a high-flying exec who's overworked, unhappy at home, and has got substantial back pain because he's stressed to the hilt and not sleeping particularly well, making profound changes to him can make a massive, massive difference to his life. And so that's where the interest in trying to be a lot more holistic came. And, we've sort of dived into thinking about sort of optimizing people's nutrition, optimizing sleep. And probably over the past, 6 to 8 years, there's been a real shift in the general public's perception of, what wellness is and how to optimize individuals. So it's much easier to get buy-in from people now across a lot of those different pillars.
Yeah. Talking about the buy-in from the public perception.
Yep.
What do you think has facilitated that shift? What's caused that kind of lens on things to be more about how am I living better, longer, and what I can do to keep myself fitter, healthier, and live a life that's actually more enjoyable?
Yeah. It's a good question, actually. I think there's probably lots of factors that have contributed to that. I think there's been some landmark books of recent years, like Outlive by Peter Attia, who has brought that to the public a lot more in terms of thinking about being proactive and looking at a preventative approach to your healthcare and wellness rather than being so reactive. I think social media probably has actually helped some of these aspects as well. There's probably a lot of dirty things that social media has contributed to, but I think getting more knowledge out there and about the benefits of exercise, about the benefits of what you can do, being fitter, being stronger, being healthier, and seeing people, these influencers potentially who are doing some of that. I think that's perhaps
it's a mixed blessing.
Bag, that one. But I think there's in the UK, perhaps the NHS has contributed to this to a degree, and people are finally sort of coming to realise that actually they can't quite rely on the NHS to pick up all the pieces all the time, because it's in reality it's relatively broken. Ideally, it's a brilliant, amazing service, but actually to get it function, the level of funding required to function at an appropriate level is just crazy. And then you've got all the middlemen sort of coming in every 4 years to sort of change that approach and change. And I think Wes Streeting right now has a pretty challenging job on his hand, but he's talking the right game. But I think the NHS has probably shone a little bit more of a light on the fact that, well, hang on, we need to think about our own health. We need to be a bit more preventative. We need to focus on our well-being a little bit more rather than have that reactive sort of medical approach. Okay, when I'm sick, I go to the doctors. And I think COVID probably was a massive public shift in that approach, and it raised people's awareness of mental health, isolation, what being unwell could do to someone, the nasty shit that viruses can do, and actually how we can actually help ourselves by being fitter, by being active, by being healthier in a lot of different ways, sleeping well, eating well, exercising, managing stress, having outlets, not eating too much sugar or smoking too much or drinking too much. And so I do think that COVID has actually led to quite a shift in the public view of health and well-being.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that it's difficult to get someone to understand something when they haven't necessarily experienced it. But going through COVID, I don't think anyone really had a choice, because when you're locked inside and all you're seeing on TV 24 hours a day is how stretched the healthcare system is, the consequences of not living well and taking care of yourself if you contract this virus, all of these things raised that awareness, put it much more into the fore, and people started to think about, okay, I actually need to take better care of myself. I need to think about, like the investment analogy, investing, best time to invest is 20 years ago, the next best time is today. That same mentality with healthcare kind of applied. And I think to the point about the NHS as well, I spoke to a guy called Tim Murdoch from Cambridge Design Partnership. And it's really funny. He mentioned about this social contract that's kind of invisible but exists with the NHS, which is pretty much you don't act like an idiot and do things that are going to put your health at risk, that are going to be damaging for your body and all of this sort of stuff. And you will have the benefit of a system that's there to support you down the line when you need it. but it's contingent on you not acting like a prat.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think for a long time we've sort of existed in this manana. We'll push and kick the can down the road
Yeah.
because we know that there's a safety net to pick us up. But now that that's kind of peeling back and actually not going to be there as much as potentially historically it was.
Yeah.
Now people are taking ownership of that. One of the things I know you're massively passionate about as well is getting this journey started much earlier.
Yep.
And recognizing that education plays a huge role in this with kids and how they can move better and how they can get more involved in sport and being physically active. So talk to me a little bit about some of the work that you're doing there as well, because I think that's really, really exciting.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of things that we've been have recently introduced. One is a bone health clinic, and that's, you're probably looking at me going, well, he's just talking about kids, and then he's asking me about kids, but I've started with the bone health clinic. But osteoporosis is a childhood disease, and the reason for that, and we call osteoporosis the silent killer, really, because there's so many people who have fractures. I think the stats are, we have 300,000 to 400,000 fractures in the UK every single year due to a bone health issue. A vast majority of that are actually the osteopenic ones, so the ones who have not yet identified that they've got a bone health issue.
Oh, wow.
And the problem being that if you fracture your neck of femur, the stats show us that up towards 60% of people over the age of 65 do not survive beyond a year. Now, that's a pretty horrifying statistic. And that can be reversed. And we know that beyond the age of 30, you lose about 1% to 2% of bone density every single year. But if you haven't reached your peak bone mass, you're already starting from a lower ceiling.
Of course.
So
you've got less of an affordance.
Exactly. So childhood exercise is absolutely critical to that. And particularly through the teenage years, and there's so much data and evidence out there that and particularly in females who tend to have this marked drop around that sort of menopause time, sort of pre-post menopause, and they lose for over a couple of years almost sort of 5 to 8% of
wow.
sort of bone density. Now, if teenagers are not doing lots of dynamic lateral movement type exercise through their teenage years, there's a good chance that they won't be actually bedding down and optimizing their sort of peak bone density or peak bone mass. And then if they're a little subpar there, they're only going to be sliding down. Because, the way I look at it is that we have evolved as hunter-gatherers. And hunter-gatherers still to this day in certain tribes will probably be walking the best part of, 7 to 12 miles a day, some more intense bits of exercise, lots of squatting, digging, rummaging, hunting for food, and then a bit of rest time. But their overall activity levels are substantially higher than what we do in this sedentary society, which is why exercise is just so critical for us. And so kids need to be doing lots of lateral sports. So basketballs, netball, amazing sports, football, rugby, great. Yeah, a few other injury risks with those, but from a bone density point of view, terrific. Running, okay, but we tend to see, bone stress injuries in that cohort, and often come nutritional,
like shin splints, stuff like
shin
that.
splints, or sort of pubic, femoral neck sort of stress fractures and that sort of thing. But yeah, tibial sort of stress fractures, sometimes your feet as well. And then nutritional deficits. So like an energy deficits type situation like REDS in some of that sort of running cohort. But interestingly, if you compared sort of all the sports who go on to have very good bone density, what do you think would give you the highest bone density of all the sports? I'll list a couple for you. Okay, so you've got swimming, cycling, wrestling, judo, basketball, gymnastics. Did I say running?
No.
Running. So of those, I'll see if I can remember the rough sort of order. What's probably the lowest of bone density
Well, I'd probably
building out of those sports?
I would have guessed swimming because your body weight supported buoyancy with water.
Yep.
Probably second to that, cycling, because you're sitting on something that's supporting some of your body weight.
Cycling is equivalent to being sedentary
Okay.
in that sense from a bone density point of view. But you're right. Swimming is it really does knock your bone density. And you're a bit of a swimmer, aren't you?
I am. A little. A slow one.
Did you train as a swimmer when you were younger at all?
No.
So if we talk about, say, swimming training, they are doing how many hours in the pool a week?
I mean, goodness. So if you're talking about a competitive swimmer like Michael Phelps or something, I mean, their schedule would have been, 3 and 3, 6 hours plus in a pool?
Yeah, extraordinary amounts. And they have, real sort of can have real bone density issues. But the best sport for your bone density is gymnastics.
Okay. Jumping, tumbling, landing from significant heights.
Exactly. The impact loading that they generate, even through their wrists. And so gymnastics is the best sport from a bone health point of view. Now, my personal view is that beyond about 12, gymnastics can become quite detrimental to the body, and particularly to females and the environment that they're in. But from a bone density point of view, through those years, it can be incredibly effective.
Wow, that's really interesting. So if I'm a parent and I want to, start getting my kids into some sports that's going to, so dynamic movements,
Definitely.
Lateral movements, things
key.
that aren't just kind of like, as you say, running up and down.
Because bones have they switch off to load after about 50 sort of impacts, okay? So they've got some receptors that basically you can go for a 5K run and you can do 50 sort of jumps on the spot or runs on the spot, and there's no difference in terms of the bone input.
Wow.
You've maxed out how your bone receptors are going to perceive that load. And when we're talking about load through the bone, we're talking about Wolff's law. So Wolff's law is basically how the bone will slowly change as force is inputted in it. And that's why you want not just linear motion, you want lateral motion as well, because that will stress the bone in a different way and strengthen the bone in a different way.
Okay. So getting up to 12, you mentioned gymnastics being fantastic.
Yep.
After that point, obviously you've mentioned some of the challenges with gymnastics potentially. What would be an efficacious kind of program or kind of guiding post for?
So if we just backtrack ever so slightly, one other thing that we've done is we've built a screening program for kids.
Cool.
The reason we've done that is because there's a massive, massive cohort of kids who just aren't exercising at the levels that they should do. Now, up to about 12, we like most children to be doing between 45 minutes and an hour of moderate to intense exercise per day. And that helps their development. That helps their musculoskeletal system. That helps their bone loading. That helps their coordination. That helps mental health. There's a whole bunch of things. But we're seeing a whole bunch of injuries now in kids that we just shouldn't be seeing because they are either not strong enough, not stable enough, or they're getting overuse type injuries from overload when they are doing a little bit because they haven't built the basic sort of support system. So if you put that factor into, okay, what's an ideal sort of training for kids, I think you've got to just have kids running around, climbing trees, playing in a playground.
Being kids.
They need to have fun. And doing anything that's they're going to enjoy is probably half the battle. So if they have an affinity to something, okay, amazing. Allow them to channel that. But if that is ballet, which I think is fantastic from a postural viewpoint in the early years, they also need to be doing something very dynamic as well. Some running or some, basketball or football where they're running and cutting and pivoting, because all of that helps, hand-eye coordination, that helps stability, that helps coordination. I just said that. That helps strength. It helps build load into the system. And so through those years, doing sports that either a ball sport and a team sport, I think are incredibly important for lots of other different reasons. But physically, it helps build their physical development, and it helps build that ability to be put in any situation, any athletic situation, and they can cope.
Yeah.
And they can squat, they can move, they can run, they can do a push-up, and it helps to build some of the foundation of movement. The problem that we see a lot of the time is that kids aren't taught a lot of this in schools. So they're not taught how to do a push-up. They're not instructed how to squat well. They're not instructed how to do a lunge. And these are just simple foundational movements that actually everyone should be able to do. And because they're not doing this, and perhaps they haven't been lucky enough to be taught through this process, they're often quite poor movers.
Yeah.
And you lay down a poor mover with a bit of load, and suddenly you're getting different injuries. And so kids need to do multi-sports where possible. And the problem becomes when they don't enjoy it. How do you encourage that if
a video game is that much more appealing?
Exactly. But that's where, you need to be creative, or let them do gymnastics as well as some, play tennis, or, something that evolves different dimensions of sport and different movement sort of patterns.
Yeah, it seems as though the prevalence of sport and being able to actually play and engage in sport, you've got the dynamic moving patterns, you've got the kind of acuity of space and spatial awareness and all of that sort of stuff, proprioception that builds, a kind of intuition amongst cooperation with teams and communication, all of that sort of stuff. If you've not had that foundation, and then kind of you've gone through your teenage years and you're now probably in this not so great movement place, how would you then take that person and say, okay, you've become educated enough now that you know that this is actually maybe where your baseline is, but you want to get better at that.
Yep.
What would you start doing with that individual, and where would you take them from there?
So they almost need to learn some simple foundation movement patterns, okay? Can they squat? Can they do a single leg balance type movement, whether that just be a single leg squat or just stand on one leg and be stable? Can they do and hold a push-up position or a plank position? What's their sort of core strength like? And then can they do a push and a pull type movement pattern? And I think all of these are really, really simple foundation movements that everyone needs to be able to do. And we would assess where they're at that point in time. And then we would advise them either and if they lacked stability or that movement awareness, then I might think about some little simple Pilates aspects, and then some really simple bodyweight exercises.
Yeah.
And that can be really simple, teach them free squats, teach them how to pull some bands, teach them how to do some, some simple single leg movement patterns, get their posterior chain and their core sort of fired up a little bit. And so depending on what was going to be appropriate for that, but I might use, some simple Pilates. It might be some simple body weight exercises that we start with. And then I'd want them raising their heart rate. I'd want them doing some cardio work to challenge their system. And there's a couple of approaches to that. In that, one, we want to just raise their heart rate for some zone 2 type work.
So just for those that might not be aware of zone 2, what would you define as kind of like a zone 2?
We zone heart rate training. Different people use different zones, but commonly there's 5 zones of heart rate. And these are the zones of what intensity you are working at of your maximum heart rate. Okay, so a very rough guide is that your max heart rate would be around 220 minus your age. Okay, and that's a pretty approximate marker. And so there's generally 5 zones, but some people use a slightly different system. But zone 2 is essentially between 60 and 70% of your maximum heart rate. Okay, so for me, I know my max heart rate is around about 175. So for me, zone 2 sort of sits around about 125. Okay, and I do a lot of cycling, so I know that if I'm going to do zone 2 work, I want my heart rate above 125 and not higher than about 138, 138 to 140. And that's sort of zone 2. Now, higher training zones mean that you're working much harder and they start recruiting a different energy system. Zone 2 is predominantly just a cardiovascular system where you're using oxygen as an energy source. And working in that zone helps to build endurance.
Okay.
It helps to build a baseline capacity into people that helps daily function. It helps life. And that's important. There's lots of other sort of health aspects that it improves, but the zone 2 training helps to build basic endurance in these kids or anyone.
It gives you a solid enough cardiovascular baseline from which you can kind of then build up.
Yeah. And then you like to also just challenge people at a higher heart rate. Now, that needs to be done sensibly and done in a way that if you're starting with someone who hasn't exercised, you wouldn't even touch that for 4 to 6 weeks because they'll just find that way too intense and it'll scare them and they'll run a mile. So, you want to get someone to engage with you and engage with the process and buy into what you're trying to achieve. And if you make it too threatening and too scary and too horrible, frankly, then they're probably not going to enjoy it.
Getting someone who's never done any sort of sports training or has literally done nothing for 5 years to do a bleep test or a VO2 max test, I can't think of many things worse at the best of times.
Yeah, completely. And so, it's got to be appropriate for that individual. But as a general rule, with some cardiovascular work, we like to have some lower level training around sort of zone 2 and then some training where we're hitting more sort of challenging your VO2 max a little bit.
Is there an optimum duration time that people should be kind of investing for like zone 2 versus that slightly higher demand exercise per week?
Good question. It depends what you're training for. So for me, I'm a road cyclist and I'm training for a couple of specific events. So I have to bias my training for those events. And likewise, if anyone's training for a marathon, okay, you've got to be specific to that particular event. But if you're just trying to optimize your well-being and optimize your health, then I like people doing about 3 bursts of cardio a week. Okay, I like 2 bits of zone 2 training for about 30 minutes, whereby you're trying to maintain your heart rate at that level. And that for me, that's, around sort of 125 and above to roughly 140, and maintaining that for about 30 minutes twice a week. I then like to do some other VO2 stuff where that session doesn't need to take much more than about 30 minutes, but you're doing almost some sprints during that period where you're working for 3-4 minute bursts of a pretty high intensity, and you're getting your heart rate up to a pretty high level where you're literally, unable to sustain that push or that cycle or that run or whatever it is that you're doing.
It's that cardio where I think we've all been there, where it's that you couldn't possibly hope to sustain a conversation. You literally, everything is focused and geared towards that output, and your performance will just precipitously decline after a certain amount of time.
But what you're wanting to do is to do several repeats of that. Okay, so you're doing 3 to 4 reps of potentially a 3 to 4 minute sort of burst of high intense exercise, whether it be faster or harder or whatever it is that you're doing. And then you have that recovery cycle to allow your heart rate to come back down, and then you go again.
Do you allow the heart rate to come all the way back down to kind of a baseline where, so let's say you do that 3-4 minutes, really intense, you then rest for a period of time. Do you let it come all the way down so that you're just where you were before that activity and then go again?
Look, and I'm not an exercise scientist per se, or I'm a sports physio who has a keen interest in this area. So I'll preface my explanation here by saying that. But it depends on the individual, how well trained they are. Someone who's not well trained, you can throw them most things and they're going to improve. They haven't done much. So you don't have to be very specific. Someone who's very well trained, you need to get far more specificity within the program. However, if I'm training someone who hasn't done a lot of this high intense stuff, I'm probably not going to start with 3 or 4 minutes intervals, because they're just not going to understand how to pace themselves over those 3 or 4 reps, and also how to try and sustain that for that length of time. So you might start with 1 to 2 minutes and build that up. Generally, it's time-based, the recovery, rather than measuring your heart rate, what it comes down to. Yes, we're interested to understand that, but generally we tend to go at that level, a 1-to-1 sort of ratio. So 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, or
Gotcha.
Something similar to that. There's lots of ways you can change that, but that's roughly what I like working on a lot of the time. And we will watch the heart rate, and the heart rate might recover to a pretty good level and back to close-ish to a normal baseline of exercise. But most of the time when you're doing these things, the sprints or on a bike, you're probably doing a very, very slow jog in between.
Yeah.
So you're still keeping some level of activity going. So it's not returning to a complete resting state. But each repetition that you do, your heart rate will not drop as low in that recovery period. And so it's going to stay higher because how hard each rep will essentially increase over that period of time. So you're going to be working exponentially harder as you're getting through that whole cycle.
So if I'm engaging in this kind of program where I've got my 2 sessions steady state cardio, for want of a better term, I've got my higher volume, I'm incorporating some of my more dynamic stuff in there.
Yep.
What are some of the things from your perspective that you also want people to be aware of or looking at in terms of mitigating risk of injuries and things like that?
And are we just talking cardiovascular stuff here?
I think we can throw into the mix a little bit, potentially some strength work as well, because I think about this from something that you said earlier. You definitely want people to be doing some dynamic movement. You want people to be doing some kind of like, squats and jumps and lunges and things like that, push-ups. That's a precursor in my kind of thought pattern to where you might want to then increase a little bit of load. And you mentioned the importance of that. So thinking about all these things together, how do you kind of like best
map that out
so that someone's getting all the benefits and hopefully none of the
None of the risk. Okay, so I have a simple way of explaining the exercises that I like people to try and achieve if they're trying to optimize themselves. So I call it 5-3-8, okay? 5 exercise sessions a week. 3 of them I like to be more strength focused, okay? And I like 2 to 3 cardio, okay? And then the 8 is 8,000 steps a day, just that daily functional load. So minimum 5 exercise sessions a week, okay? And a lot of the time you don't have to, you can be combining your strength and your cardio because you might be doing more of a HIIT style workout as one of your sessions, and that's spiking your heart rate for that period of time.
Yeah, I mean, if you're training for like a high rocks or something like that.
Exactly. So what we always do with people is that for me, if we're working with someone, they have to learn how to move first though. So how much load we can put in them is very much dependent on their previous exercise experience, but also very much down to how effective a mover they are. Are they a motor moron, in which we're starting with some real basics and we've got to retrain some movement patterns and some tolerance to load? Or are they someone who's got some good exercise experience? They've exercised in the past and we should be able to move them on relatively quickly with some progressions through some simple sort of loaded exercise. But I like incorporating a mix of proper strength work. So whether that be, a combination of upper body pulls and pushes, lower body pulls and pushes. I like people to be doing squat patterns, step up, lunges, split squats. I think they're some of my go-to exercises. And then I like people to be able to do a bunch of upper body pushes and pulls. I think in terms of what I'm looking for when I'm talking about optimizing people, I'm always thinking, okay, well, we're probably on a downhill slope in terms of losing muscle mass, in terms of potential bone density issues, and other things cropping up medically along the way. And what we want to try to do is to ensure that we get ourselves in as good a state as possible so that we can have that optimal health span at the end of our life. And to do that, I think the stronger you are, the more likely you are to stave off mechanical issues, muscle injuries, joint injuries. If you can continue to do that, you're highly likely to not succumb to any sarcopenia, osteopenia, any of those type of illnesses. If you can do some cardio and hitting both sort of zones, then you're highly likely to mitigate some of the effects of cardiovascular disease, cancer risk, neurodegenerative conditions, metabolic disorders. And so looking at how to map that out, I like people doing those 5 sort of bits of exercise. However, what's going to be appropriate for you might be very different from me and very different from Joe Bloggs down the road. And that is dependent on their past exercise experience and actually what they enjoy doing as well. Some of the time, they might need to do stuff that they just don't enjoy.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that kind of it's a point that I think a lot of people miss, in that your adherence is going to be very little if you don't enjoy what you're doing. And I think I'm going to admit that I'm pretty shocking with my mobility work, but I have since gotten a newfound appreciation for that. When having shoulder surgery, I've needed to incorporate that as a core foundation of a program that I've got to keep myself healthy.
Yep.
And, even when I haven't maybe done as much of that, and I've gone into something like swimming, doing that a little bit more frequently for my zone 2, then I've realised, my shoulder's a little bit stiffer. Maybe I need to start doing a little bit more of that work again and kind of prehabbing, for want of a better term, those things. With those people that then, let's just say this person's kind of taken themselves from this place where they've built up that baseline.
Yeah.
They're in a good spot. What would you like to see for kind of making sure that they, in the best possible way, prepare themselves for that kind of, for want of Peter or Tia's term here, centenarian decathlon? Like, we've spoken about, obviously, my challenges with mobility and things like that.
Yep.
How do you want to see that kind of evolve for people with the different things that go on through life as they kind of like...
Okay, so someone's training for a centenarian decathlon.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to position this for, as a conversation is really about that everyday athlete.
Yep.
They're not going to be the person that's potentially doing that one specific thing. They're wanting to just live as healthy as possible for as long as possible.
Yep. Okay. So where do we go with that particular individual who's trained a little bit, has an okay base?
Yeah, where do we see them, and where do you see them from your perspective in terms of what are the most common things that occur when someone walks through your door that could have been avoided with a little bit of, guidance in the right way? What are some of the things that you then, if that does happen, you can probably dive into like how you would probably address that and then mitigate against it in the future.
Yep. Okay. So I think it depends on past injuries. Okay, so that's a big one to just flag up. Okay, you talk about your shoulder. Okay, so that's a little yellow flag to understand, okay, well, what's led to that shoulder issue in the past? Or if it's spinal issues or knee issues, okay, what's been the driver for that? And that is the biggest thing that I think we need to identify as clinicians, that we must be able to understand, okay, well, what was the driver that led to that injury? Because that will... If you're not unraveling either that movement pattern or either that crappy training approach that someone was using or just all the beach weights that someone was doing, then you're probably just going to head down that same pathway. So I think trying to just understand the client and understand what their past injuries have been and what's led them to where they are now is really key. I think having a good movement screen to understand where they are right now and what they can do across 3 parameters. So across strength, across mobility, and across control and stability. And we have a pretty simple process whereby we screen people across those different parameters. So looking at spinal mobility. And for me, if you want a good health span, you need to remain mobile through your spine, particularly your thoracic spine. Okay? Because that is key to your neck and to your lumbar spine. And if you're not mobile through there, it can overload your low back, it can overload your neck, it can lead to shoulder issues. And so when we're looking at someone, we'll screen them across all those mobility, and that will also be mobility through their pelvis, through the legs, calf, ankle complex, and also the shoulder girdle. Then we'll look at control and stability. Centrally, how are they switched on through their pelvis, and then single leg patterns with that, and then we'll look at some strength markers. And one of the easiest strength markers to look at is grip strength, and it gives you a very, very broad overview to identify where someone is. And that's a really simple marker to, if someone's got a good grip, generally they're quite strong, and it massively reduces risk of early mortality. And so we look at someone across those 3 sort of parameters. And then dependent on what flavor or what style they present in each, we will bias a program to that. However, as a general rule, I like 2-ish strength exercises. And I'll probably, with girls, I'll probably push more strength stuff. And with guys, I may just pull back a little bit on the strength stuff and get them doing more Pilates work, more mobility work.
I was going to ask this because you mentioned it a couple of times previously, and obviously you mentioned about that mobility through your thoracic spine and this and that and the other. And your practice has a big emphasis on, Pilates and movement and things like that. Is that part of the reason that, that is such a part of the...
It's part of what we do. And I've worked as a sports and spinal physio, I suppose, for 25 years. And Pilates has been a really, really effective medium to build stability and retrain movement patterns for people. Because when it comes to spinal issues, you've got simple structural overload issues. But what's led them to that in the first place? Is that just genetics? Well, genetics play a part in that. But you can dial up and down your epigenome, and it's how you've moved over a long period of time or not moved that's potentially led to that overload. So addressing those movement factors and helping to improve how someone not only moves, but then their muscle patterns around that, then layer endurance, and then layer strength, is the sequence which we try to move people in. And I like using Pilates as a framework for that approach because I find it just really effective. It's all postural. It's all, as I sit here slightly slouched.
I'm acutely aware of myself doing that.
It's all about sort of moving centrally and all about being posturally aware and being able to drive good movement patterns. And so it can be a really effective medium for that. And there's lots of other things that can do that as well. But then dovetail that with really good strength work. And I think, the strength work can truly get you strong. Pilates can do that. But what I love about Pilates is that it maintains mobility and stability, and it injury-proofs you from some of this other more one-dimensional training. So, the strength work is definitely key, and I want people gradually pushing more and more load, and that's super important from a muscle hypertrophy point of view, strength gains, bone health, and there's some landmark trials based around sort of bone health that have shown that actually pushing proper load is the way forwards for anyone with osteopenia and osteoporosis. But I think having that nice combination of Pilates, mobility, yoga can be great for some people as well. But it depends what flavor they present with.
Yeah.
Their body presents with, if that makes sense. Then some strength work, and then those other cardio aspects.
That's really, I think this is really helpful because it paints a picture and provides a framework for people to really start to understand from a point of view of, we've covered off the basics in terms of you've got to be eating well, you've got to be sleeping well, you've got to be, looking after your stress levels, but looking after your movement as the longest lever that you have. I think one of the things that a lot of people need help with often is also protecting themselves within that movement. And that's obviously where you come in and able to give that guidance and that advice. Are there kind of things that we've covered off in the foundational level, obviously? Are there some things that are a little bit more kind of whiz-bang techie that you're seeing emerge that are, giving you some...
Yeah.
You mentioned about the bone health clinic. I know that there's certain things that are, force press plates and things like that. What are some of the things that you're actually quite excited about from the technical realm?
So we have created and launched a bone health clinic. And as I've dived deeper and deeper into this, I've just realized that, we're at the start of a massive epidemic of bone health issues because we're just not moving and loading ourselves in the way that we were designed to. So there's some new technology that we use to scan people with. And, my view is that if you don't know, how can you change it? So understanding where your body's at, screening early is so important to capture things. And, there's a world of sort of new clinics and places popping up that offer full body MRIs and blood work and screens. And all of those can be incredibly useful to do, and they can highlight areas of deficiency and areas that crop up that perhaps become a problem 5 years down the line. So you can identify them a little bit earlier. But where we're using different tech, we use, rather than DEXA scans, although DEXA scans are still the gold standard from a bone density point of view, we're using another technology called Echo Light REMS machine. Now that's an ultrasound-driven scan, so it's more portable, it's not radiation, and it's reliable, and you can do it regularly as opposed to a DEXA. And what it gives you is not only bone density, which is giving you your T-scores and your Z-scores, and your T-scores are a marker of whether you are osteopenic or in the normal zone for your age, or osteopenic or osteoporotic. And the Ecolite REMS gives you bone density, but also bone quality. Now, the bone quality is an important aspect that DEXAs don't give you, because it is highlighting the architecture of the bone. And that is actually incredibly important because it allows us to be fairly safe that we can load someone more effectively with confidence that actually they're not really at risk here, because actually whilst they might have low bone density, their bone quality is actually incredibly good.
Okay.
And that's pretty cool technology that we're using, and it's AI driven, the report. So it's not user dependent. I mean, yes, you've got a scan and the machine will tell you whether it's an appropriate scan or not. Whereas a DEXA is interpreted by the radiologist. Okay. And so you get variation within the DEXAs.
Gotcha.
So we're using that, but we have an osteogenic loading machine, which we're incredibly excited about, called a biodensity machine. And what that is, it is using isometric exercise, high load isometric exercise, to put substantial force through your hips, spine, and core and upper body. And what it does, it tracks the amount of force that you're imparting on some force plates. And so there's a force plate in the chair, and there's a force plate on the sort of platform that moves. And so there's 4 key movements that you do with this. One is a leg press. One is a vertical pull, like a deadlift type movement. Another is a chest press, okay? And another is a core pull. And this machine allows you to put multiples of your body weight in force through your system. And why that's really cool is that you need high load to stimulate bone loading. And we don't get that through any other method. Like, you might be able to do a back squat, and I know you like to work out, you've got some guns on you. So you can back squat. How much do you back squat?
About 180.
180 kilos? Okay. And you weigh?
90.
Okay. So that's twice your body weight. Okay. So that's a big back squat too. But so that's putting twice your body weight in force through your spine, through your hips. Now, you could probably leg press on a machine. So I hit 2,200 pounds on our machine.
Wowzers.
Okay. Now, that's not because I like to think I'm super strong, but not just because of that. But because of the nature of
that cycling.
Yeah, the isometric load on it, you're actually able to max out for a 5-second hold and push very, very heavy load.
Okay.
Now, that's equivalent to, what's that, 1,000 odd kilos?
Yeah, that's...
I'm 80 odd kilos. Okay, so I'm putting 10, 12-fold the force in load through the system, which imparts massive sort of change. That's what you're getting if you're a gymnast and you're doing one of those triple flips and then suddenly coming down and landing on your feet. And so this machine allows us to safely put load into people that not only builds their strength, it builds bone density, and there's good studies to suggest that. And it also builds confidence in people. It builds an ability to feel as though they're a lot more resilient because we track their numbers. And so we can see and plot over a period of time that they're gradually getting stronger and stronger. But not only that, they're optimizing their bone health at the same time. So it's a simple 10-minute exercise system that we get people doing once a week.
That's amazing. I know you mentioned about some of the challenges that the NHS obviously has.
Yep.
Bringing it back to that kind of accessibility point,
Yep.
obviously you have a private clinic and your facilities are not available to kind of like general public, other than if they book, not available if you go through NHS.
Yeah.
If you were
we're
to
private, yes.
If you were to go through an NHS pathway, would you have accessibility to things like this? Could you request them? If not, what's the sort of level that you would be looking at if you wanted to take this test? Because I personally believe that forewarned is forearmed, and as we've both spoken about and enumerated in a numerous number of times, for you to be prepared for later on, it gives you so much more value. So what should people be kind of expecting to...
So the problem with bone health is that NICE guidelines suggest that people should only have a DEXA scan. I believe it's over 50, so don't quote me on this one, but I believe it's over 50 for females postmenopausal. And I think it's a higher age rate for men if they're at risk, if they're significant smoker, significant drinker, or have had one or two other sort of fractures.
Okay.
Now, the problem with that is the DEXAs are difficult to access on the NHS. They're not particularly expensive privately. You can probably get one for 180 to 200 pounds. However, there's a low dose of radiation, which some people don't like. It's pretty low, but there's still a degree of radiation. And there's not many DEXAs around. Now, part of the reason for that is that they fall under the CQC guidelines. And so the amount of hoops that you need to jump through to ensure that from a radiology point of view that you have appropriate staffing and appropriate setup and for that. So the bone health guidelines are not adequate, I don't feel, at the moment. Okay? The NICE guidelines are very reactive. They are not proactive. They're trying to capture people when there's already an issue there. So they're capturing people, you've had a fall, you've had a fracture. Let's just check your bone density. Oh, yes, look, that's terrible. You've got osteoporosis.
By that point, it's too late.
It's not, but it's much harder.
Yes.
And so we know that this is more commonly associated with females. They're at higher risk because they have a greater hormonal change through menopause. However, we've got some 25-year-old guys coming into our clinic with bone health issues. Now, that's because of, some steroid use, as in oral steroids for asthma, or they've had an autoimmune condition. And these lead to, that's one of the serious sort of contraindications or precautions with oral steroids, that it can lead to some of these other deleterious sort of health issues down the line.
And this is really interesting, actually, because obviously, as a society generally, we have a rise in certain chronic conditions. And, during research, because I'm obviously about to become a new dad, you start reading about kind of the benefits of, vaginal birth versus cesarean. And in the situation that my wife's in, she will have to have a cesarean. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of benefit to natural birth that come with, many studies are showing actually benefits to, chronic conditions that turn up later, the gut microbiome in the baby and things like that. With those conditions becoming more and more prevalent, also, and I'm not demonizing this by saying it, the rise in things like veganism and diets where nutrient deficiency could be a real thing and a factor for people who are not actually supplementing properly, it's no wonder that we're seeing people come into your clinics and into the doctor's surgery with bone density conditions at much younger ages.
Yeah.
And I really take seriously the point that you make about the fact that we're at the serious risk of an epidemic of people with bone density conditions, and we're not treating that seriously until they show signs of already being in that position.
Yeah, completely.
Which, it's almost like putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah.
We have an opportunity to provide movement screening up front for kids in school.
Yeah.
And to get them on a pathway where they find the sport that they like. They find the things that they enjoy that get them to engage in those dynamic movement patterns. We're missing an opportunity there.
Yeah, definitely.
We miss an opportunity later in terms of, by secondary school, if you are a kid who's gone through primary school believing that you're crap at sport or not a particularly great athlete, you've already checked out. So we miss another opportunity to capture people.
Are you going to engage with sport?
100%. And then also now we have a further downstream consequence, which is, if you've pretty much checked out, then you get some health problem, and you see how it goes. You just see it.
It's a slippery slope.
Slippery slope all the way to the bottom.
Yeah. And we're been mainly talking about musculoskeletal conditions, but the benefits of eating well, sleeping, and exercise, as well as some of the other pillars that we've talked about, there's a huge body of evidence that it reduces your overall risk of mortality from cardiac conditions, metabolic conditions, and we're immersed in perhaps an obesity epidemic or certainly a metabolic disorder epidemic. And it also reduces cancer risk. If you can exercise relatively intensely, over a certain, I think what was the figure? Something like over 300 minutes a week, your risk of mortality from cancer massively diminishes.
Wow! So 300 minutes a week.
I think there's steps. The WHO guidelines are 150 minutes a week. That's what we're trying to get everyone to exercise. So that's 5 times 30 minutes a week. That's and that's moderate levels of exercise, moderate to intense levels of exercise. But it scales up. And I think if you're doing huge numbers, the risk of cancer actually diminishes significantly further.
Yeah, and you mentioned something earlier about kind of neurodegenerative diseases, and that was something that I knew that the Lancet report released, something around the incidences of dementia being drastically reduced through exercise. Yeah. Hearing loss as well was one of the things. So anything that affects your kind of like inputs, but the risk factors that come along with metabolic dysfunction, obesity, lack of exercise, things like that, they play a huge role in things going wrong in your body in general.
Yeah.
And this is where I think it's really important to the point about engaging people up front earlier. And that's the part that I guess is frustrating from my perspective when I'm seeing this kind of opportunity pass us by, where through simply going squats, lunges, push-ups, it's really not difficult to get people on that journey.
I think the tricky part is education, educating people, and that it's important. Because if you have a musculoskeletal issue, something breaks down in the system. So it's harder to walk or to run because you're uncomfortable, you can't sort of exercise. Then, okay, what exercise can you do? How do you continue exercising at a level that's going to reduce those the impacts of some of those, or the 4 horsemen, as Peter Attia calls them, but any of those things that we generally succumb to, which is the neurodegenerative conditions, cancer, cardiac or metabolic issues. So if you've got a mechanical issue, how do you maintain your exercise, and vice versa? If you've got a cardiac issue, how do you ensure that, okay, you can continue exercising with a cardiac issue, because it's sort of all wrapped in one. So ensuring that you can be a good mover and be strong and be fit is one of the best things you can do to try to protect yourself against this whole, these sort of 4 different pillars of things that generally we're all succumbing to at some stage.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons that I positioned this conversation from that preventative side, because I know that you're hugely passionate about, obviously when people come into your clinic, you can fix them and you can get them back to moving really well. But what you'd really rather them do was be able to be moving well in the first place so that you can actually live healthier longer. I think one of the other areas that I kind of wanted to touch on, or one of the questions that I really had for you was, if you could create, you've got a magic wand and you can create some sort of policy change that would be something that you think would make a huge impact very quickly, or potentially over the next generation, what would it be?
I think it would have to be around exercise. I think it would have to be ensuring that exercise is just mandatory at the school level, and it is, but it's given not enough sort of credibility, perhaps, or not enough importance.
Well, it's the joke, right? The PE teacher is the joke of the school system, and actually, what we're seeing now is that maybe if that wasn't such a...
Because, I mean, if you look at it from a point of view of, we have designed to move. We are essentially hunter-gatherers, yet we have created a society whereby we live substantially longer now. And amazing. We don't die from, that tiger who was trying to run after us, or we don't succumb to polio or typhoid or any of these horrible illnesses that were around a lot earlier. And we're living much longer, which is amazing. However, the last 20-odd years for a lot of people are not amazing years. And actually, that all starts with integrating and imparting great habits from a very, very early age. And I think that habit needs to come with, along with mental stimulus, reading, eating well, imparting knowledge about how important sleep is. I would have a fantastic health education program in schools. Some schools do this very well, but I would get kids moving. I would train them through basic movement patterns. They'd all have to go through a screening process whereby we would be able to identify how they're moving, what their deficits are, and age match them to go, you know what, this is where you are now, okay? You should be able to do X, Y, and Z for your age. Let's give you some simple exercises to boost you up now, because otherwise you're playing massive catch up in 20 years' time, whereby they come to you, they haven't enjoyed exercise, they haven't developed the necessary movement patterns, strength, and then that's led to perhaps already not achieving their peak bone mass, perhaps not building the necessary strength in their system. They've already had a little back injury, and they're not, they've discovered that socializing and going out is a better, more attractive option. Now, that's great, but where does it leave you down the line?
So I think addressing that point, one of the things that I wanted to ask that could potentially be a little bit more of a difficult topic is, do we kind of need the parents back in the room to actually sometimes say to kids, well, actually, you might not enjoy this, but it's actually the right thing for you to do.
But suck it up.
Suck it up.
Yes.
Because what I'm hearing is that you're going to have kids that, they need to learn how to do these exercises. They need to learn how to play sport and collaborate and communicate with one another, because it also has social benefits as well.
Completely.
And will be staving off and preventing them from a catalogue of issues later on. What would you kind of say to those parents if their kids pushing back and saying, "Oh, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this," and you're feeling maybe like a bad parent to force them into doing it?
Look, I completely agree, and I think we as a parent, I've got two boys who are 12 and 14. Thankfully, whether that's through our dominating sort of parenting in terms of thrusting them into all sorts of sports and taking them here, there, and everywhere, they love sport, and they'll always happily go to the gym, go and play cricket, tennis, golf, football, whatever it may be. You have to find something that they can do. They need to be exercising. It's so critical for their computer, it's so critical for their body, for all sorts of positive sort of health benefits from it. If they don't enjoy running around in football, like I'm a big advocate of team sport because I think what it gives you, it teaches you so much about life, about winning, about working together, about pulling, the values of hard work, teamwork, about lifting people up when you've had a loss, and life is not always a level playing field. These schools whereby everyone gets a ribbon for participation, I'm like, that ain't real life.
No.
It's a dogfight out there a lot of the time. Yes, okay, we need to protect them and nurture these kids, but they have to be running around doing stuff. So can you find something that they like? Can you find something that they enjoy? Be that going to a little gym, and you've got to impart this really early and, get involved as the parents.
Yeah.
Get involved with them, play with them. Generally kids want their parents' attention. So if you can play with them and build that fun into that activity, I think that's key. Because ultimately, yes, the ideal is that they love it and want to go and do it, but that doesn't always happen. But they do need to be doing some of this for their own benefit.
Yeah, there is that question as well around your kids don't necessarily do what you say, they do what you do.
Yeah.
And if you give them that positive example, get involved with them, go and play a sport with them, even if you're not particularly the greatest tennis player in the world, take them to a tennis court or whatever,
Exactly.
just pick up a couple of rackets and do something with them. The benefit, if they happen to fall in love with that, is going to be incredible for them later on.
Definitely. Yeah.
What would be your kind of, if you were to leave people with parting thoughts, what would be the things that you really want people to be considering in terms of how they look after themselves, getting themselves living as healthy as they possibly can for as long as they can? What should we be focusing on with kind of like minimum standards of how we look after ourselves? And then how can people get in touch with you and, find out more about what you're doing?
Okay. So lots of little bits there. I think one aspect which we haven't completely dived into is actually creating little habits. And for someone who doesn't do a lot, this can be like, oh shit, this is all a bit daunting. And you need to start really small and start with whatever's probably going to give you the most profound impact. So if that's just lightly tweaking your sleep and going to bed at a more regular time, and then trying to go, right, I just want you to do something 3 times a week. I just want you to go and do these little exercises that I'm going to give you, and then get on an exercise bike, or the other way around, and do something for 30 to 40 minutes a week. Amazing. Or it might be as simple as, I'm going to give you these 3 things. I want you to do them every day. And it's just creating a little habit, because if they get something beneficial out of that, they're going to be, there's going to be more impetus to want to grow that, to change that, and if you can get that buy-in, which is what I talk to my team about, which you absolutely need, you need to get buy-in from the client about why this is important. Because if you don't have that, it's going to be pretty hard to make that change.
Yeah.
But I think start with some very realistic goals to create some habits. If you're really wanting to optimize yourself, I think you need to be thinking about minimum 150 minutes of exercise a week. Okay, that's WHO guidelines. Okay, even though Donald Trump has just pulled out of that, but that is the World Health Organization guidelines for a minimum exercise standard for people per week. And you need a combination of things in your life. You need some strength work. You need some mobility and stability. So I like that Pilates. I'm a bit biased there, but that's what I love using. You've got to push load with that strength stuff. You've got to get shit stronger. It's pretty simple. And then you need some cardio. You've got to lightly stress the system. Okay, that's what we're doing. We're stressing the system to cleanse it in a way and to stimulate some more change.
Well, this is one of the things. I mean, obviously, I don't want to get too far into the science of all of this sort of stuff, but all of these things that we're talking about in terms of, that cardiovascular health, that strength training, that's helping with, ATP production, your mitochondrial health, and then kind of autophagy, like the cleansing, as you mentioned, of your cells, like the replacement of those senescent or dying cells in your body. Like you are just basically refreshing the oil tank in your engine, and you're giving it what it needs to function at its optimal level by a very simple stimulus, which is exercise. And as you say, it's the longest lever in attacking kind of any number of the problems that you'll face later on. One of the things that you kind of reminded me of there was, that pushing load piece where it's, important to be able to do a step up, which you mentioned earlier, or a squat. Well, you might not think in your 20s and 30s that that's an important thing to be able to do. You can do that pretty easily. But when you're 65, 70, and you're trying to walk down a flight of stairs, and you're a little bit unsteady on your legs, and you don't have the strength, if you slip or trip, to catch yourself, that's when you get into real difficulty. Because if you get a lower limb fracture that keeps you off your feet after the age of 65, that is pretty much a death sentence.
Yeah, you're right. I think, your balance is a little part of that, but having that power to catch yourself, I think is really
well, I think it's all of
important.
it. It's the balance, exactly that, to be able to kind of like have that 1 foot up that you're really putting down onto the next one, and then having the power to catch yourself, and then, the cardio to even be walking up the stairs as well. So it's all three.
Exactly. And so, we naturally over every sort of decade, we lose about sort of 7 or 8% muscle mass and strength. And so, we want to optimize ourselves as much now, because naturally our bodies weren't designed to live 110, 120, 130 odd years. Yes, okay, maybe we're going to be doing
Brian
some
Johnson
of that.
certainly has designs on that.
Yes, definitely. But we want to be able to be, however long, if you do want to live longer, but you want that last 20, 30 years to be very active. You want to be super strong. You want to be able to go and travel, run around, play with your grandchildren, lift bags, carry, do all of these sorts of things. And that has to start now, because everything is going to slide down a little bit. And if you want to be able to run up those stairs, which you can do relatively comfortably now, then you need a good VO2 now, because it's only going to slip down a little bit. So keeping yourself as fit and strong as possible will help to stave off a whole host of those issues. And I think, some people recognize that they just need to do this, and they just make it a habit that they read a book while they're doing their bike, or they, watch a little video or listen to a podcast, and they make it sort of interesting and insightful for themselves. And other people really, really buy into it and love it. But whatever you do, you need a combination of strength, stability, mobility, and cardio in your life.
If you have that person that is starting from nothing, and let's just say they have ambitions of doing something pretty extreme, like a marathon, which you're probably going to have a quite common experience with someone who's not really trained that much, and then all of a sudden in April they're supposed to run 26.2 miles. Where would you start with in terms of prepping that person, saying, okay, if you're going to do this sensibly,
Yep.
what are the things that you should be, considering, and then potentially working with someone like yourself to keep you fit and healthy. Would that be things like massage, incorporating that as part of a training protocol as well? What things should people be considering within this kind of, within this landscape?
Yeah, okay. So there's lots of pretty sensible run programs out there. And I think one of the basic thing is manage your load, okay? There's so much evidence out there to suggest that your history of running determines how many injuries you might have. So your running exposure, if you like. So if you've got less than 2 years of decent running exposure, you're much more likely to have an injury.
So if people want to find you, mate,
yep.
Where should they go?
We have 3 sites where my company is Mayfair Health. We are in Marylebone, Mayfair and South Kensington. We've got 2 big sites and a smaller site. But mayfairhealth.co.uk is our company. I practice out of there. You can get in touch with us on our email off the website. There's a phone number on there that I can't even remember now, but we're also on socials and that sort of thing. But we treat lots of different sorts of injuries, sports spinal injuries, a range of from Joe Blogs to your elite athletes, and have an awesome team that will help to understand the drivers for what's got people in that situation, and then look at someone very holistically and how to map out a recovery plan for them.
Epic stuff. Man, I think we've covered an awful lot today, and I hope it gives people a good foundation from which they can, sensibly approach health and looking after themselves.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you for watching today's discussion with Simon Gilchrist. If you would like to discuss any of the topics mentioned in today's episode in greater detail, please do check out any of the links in the captions below, where you can get in touch with Simon or us at Explosive Brands. At explosivebrands.com, you can also sign up to our newsletter. Our newsletter contains interesting articles from around the world of health, thought leadership pieces, and summaries of previous podcast episodes. We will never share your details with anyone, no third-party providers, or anyone else that might market to you. We hope to see you again soon.